6. Marriage and monogamy. One of the facts which disturbs many persons with respect to biblical laws concerning marriage is the seeming tolerance of polygamy, of more than one wife, and the total intolerance of adultery, which in the Old Testament called for the death penalty. The moralist today will tolerate adultery, but not polygamy. The answer to this conflict of viewpoints lies in an analysis of the biblical law. First of all, very clearly, the purpose of God in creation was that monogamy be the standard for man. The original perfect standard saw the creation of Eve, one woman, for Adam, one man, Genesis 2:18-24. The normative marriage is clearly monogamous. Second, polygamy clearly appears as a product of the fall in a world of sin. The first recorded bigamous marriage is that of Cain's descendant, Lamech, who had Adah and Zillah as wives, Genesis 4:23. Third, the prohibition of polygamy is implied in Genesis 2:23-24, and is stated in one reading of Leviticus 18:18, "Thou shalt not take a wife to another, to vex her, to uncover her nakedness beside her in her lifetime." The Berkeley version, while reading it in terms of the King James Version, still separates it from the laws of incest, Leviticus 18:6-17, and reads the first clause as, "while your wife is still living," which points to the prohibition of bigamy. Fourth, 1 Timothy 3:2 makes it clear that polygamy was forbidden to church officers. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife. The Montanists read this as a ban on all second marriages, which they termed bigamous. A widower or a widow was thus still bound by the original marriage. There is no biblical warrant for such an interpretation. Fifth, there is at least an implied condemnation of polygamy in Deuteronomy 17:17, which forbade the king to multiply wives to himself. Similarly, the high priest could only marry one wife, and that a virgin, Leviticus 21:13-14. Sixth, it is clearly stated by Jesus Christ that marriage is the union of one man and one woman, and that this is the meaning of Genesis 2:24. It is the two or twain who are one flesh, that is, a true marriage, Matthew 19:5. Seventh, St. Paul spoke of marriage in monogamous terms. Let every man have his own wife, and every woman her own husband, 1 Corinthians 7:2. In passage after passage, monogamy is assumed to be the God-ordained standard. On the other hand, in many passages, polygamy is a recognized and accepted fact, not only among the reprobate, like Lamech, Genesis 4:19, and Esau, Genesis 26:34, 28:9, and 36:2, but also among the patriarchs and saints. Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines, Genesis 29:15, Elkanah, 2 wives, 1 Samuel 1:1-2. Gideon, David, and Solomon, many wives, and concubines as well. Adam, Noah, Lot, Isaac, Moses, and many others were monogamous. The instances of polygamy in the Bible are not too many, but they are conspicuous to us because of their variation from our standards and practices. The law did recognize and regulate concubinage and polygamy. First, a man could not simply use a concubine. She was entitled to her food, clothing, and to sexual relations without diminution. Failure to do these 3 things was ground for divorce, without any recompense of the dowry or of the bridal money, Exodus 21:10-11. Not even a war captive woman could be denied her rights, Deuteronomy 21:10-14. Second, a bondmaid betrothed to a husband, Leviticus 19:20, that is, a girl who has been secured as a concubine, could not be put to death for adultery. Both she and the guilty man could only be punished by scourging. The reason is given: they shall not be put to death because she was not free, Leviticus 19:20. A principle is clearly in evidence here. To whom much is given, from him much can be expected. But since a concubine receives a limited status and receives less dignity in the marriage, only a limited loyalty can be expected. She was expected to be faithful, but in case of adultery, her punishment was less, because her status was lower than that of the endowed wife. The wife had the security of her dowry and a status of authority. Her punishment for adultery, as was the punishment for her husband for adultery, was death. Third, it is thus apparent that the law tolerated polygamy while establishing monogamy as the standard. The reason for this toleration was the fact that the polygamous family was still a family, a lower form of family life, but a tolerable one, whereas polyandry is not, since it violates the basic centrality of the man and his calling. Biblical law thus protects the family and does not tolerate adultery, which threatens and destroys the family. Humanistic law protects the anarchistic individual by denying that adultery is a crime, and it sacrifices the family progressively to the individual. Polygamy thus is tolerated in biblical law, but the standard established by the creation ordinance and laid down by St. Paul for members, 1 Corinthians 7:2, and for officers, 1 Timothy 3:2, of Christ's kingdom is monogamy. Having said this, it is necessary to add that ancient polygamy had often other than sexual aspects. An important aspect of ancient polygamy was its governmental function. A man of wealth needed trustworthy associates to assume the government of an estate, or a ruler needed persons to act as his agents in a province or city. A wife was usually the most reliable associate under such circumstances. Very commonly, the woman was the widow of an experienced officer or ruler, often elderly, so that sexual relations frequently did not occur. She was visited from time to time by her husband, whose authority reinforced hers by his visits. If she dwelt within his home, such a wife was entrusted with the supervision of certain aspects of his business. In Solomon's case, most of his wives and concubines represented foreign alliances and were a means of establishing both peace with Israel and favorable trade relations with it. If they were sexually attractive, this furthered their usefulness. A princess sent to Solomon's court would be accompanied by several nobly born ladies in waiting and some concubines or slave girls. All would be sent with the advantage of the mother country in mind. Their marriage to Solomon and their pride in his power and glory made them loyal to Solomon. Their national origin led them obviously to seek diplomatic and commercial advantages for their mother country. Polygamous wives have thus been a common answer to the need for a civil service. Forms of this governmental polygamy still survive in various parts of the world, although on the wane. Another form of polygamy is economic. This is especially prevalent in quote-unquote primitive cultures. In African tribes, for example, since much of the farm work depends on the wife, a second wife means another field worker. It is not at all surprising that in economic polygamy, the overworked wife welcomes help in the form of additional wives. A rarer form of polygamy has been as a remedy for disaster. Such instances have been very rare, and the pretext of necessity often used. Mormon polygamy was religious and soteriological. Women were in short supply, but polygamy was held to be a religious requirement or ordinance. The 30 Years' War saw so fearful a devastation, so many men killed, and so many women left unprotected that the Diet legalized polygamy briefly in order to bring about a restoration of family life. Most polygamy, especially in modern times, has been essentially sexual in purpose, and it is this kind of polygamy which most people associate with the word. The dream concept of foolish men is of a lordly male ability to use a number of women at will. This idea is very much an illusion. Several things militate against this dream. First, polygamous marriages are still marriages. They involve the union of two families. The wife or concubine cannot be dealt with at will without offending the in-laws. In a polygamous marriage, the woman tends to be closer to her family than to her husband. Mistreatment of the wife can mean serious trouble with in-laws who are now enemies. Very few men have been powerful enough to disregard this factor. Apart from a few monarchs, the men who have been able in any generation to disregard the woman's family have been scarce. In a polygamous family, the ties to the family of origin are usually intense and jealous. Second, if a sultan need not fear his in-laws because he is too powerful, he still must fear his wives and concubines, who can do him much harm. The Turkish sultans drowned wives and concubines in great numbers. We know that as many as 300 women were drowned on some occasions. sometimes for intrigue, once for pleasure during the reign of Ibrahim, who, after one of his debauches, decided to get rid of his old harem and have the fun of replacing it. But it must be added, even the Turkish sultans, when not murdering their wives, moved with some fear of them. The sultan's favorite for the night was smuggled secretly into his room to avoid the jealous eyes of other members of the harem and of the favorite or queen. Moreover, custom as well as a satisfactory relationship required the sultan to pay her money, jewels, and clothes to the degree of pleasure received. Where the relationship between lord and harem members was so slight a one, these gifts were necessary to add incentives to the relationship. Thus, even with the power to kill his wives at will, the sultan still had to sneak into an appointed room like an adulterer in order to live with his wives. Third, in every society, whether polygamous or monogamous, certain obligations exist between man and wife. These duties are not as strict in a monogamous marriage, because then husband and wife are normally working together for a common goal. In polygamous marriages, the obligations of the husband are spelled out more precisely to prevent the abuse of any wife. The following example is typical. Quote, "Among several tribes of the Syrian-Arabian desert, a man has to divide his marital attentions equally between his two wives. He must alternately spend one night with one and one with the other. Each of the wives cook for him a day in turn, and on that day it is the woman's right to have the husband spend the night with her, whether he cohabits with her or not. If the husband spends the night with one wife out of turn, he must compensate the other with a sheep or a goat as the price for her night. Sometimes the two wives strike a bargain, and one of them buys a night from the other whose turn it is." End quote. Certain things are implicit in this which are rarely written about, but are common knowledge in polygamous countries. The husband's sexual rights in a polygamous marriage are technically broad, but actually severely limited. He pays for any liberty he exercises. Moreover, he faces quarreling wives who are rivals for his favor, but unite as women against him. If he has two or more wives, he must enjoy the cooking of all. If he eats lightly of one woman's cooking, she is furious and jealous. At the same time, she will brag to the other wives of how he gorged himself on the desserts she fed him at bedtime. In a like manner, each wife will boast of his sexual prowess with her. Thus, the tired man is told by a furious wife that he was passionate enough last night with another. Let him prove it tonight with her instead of resting. The next morning, she will declare to the other women that she hardly slept all night, so furious and continuous was her husband's passion. As a result, the poor man is in trouble with the next wife, and sure of another harried night. The distrust and hatred of women is deeply embedded in all polygamous societies, and polygamous men are not known as homebodies. The life of the polygamous husband is one of ostensible power, but of actual bondage. It can be added that because the harem women have their set bed rights in rotation, there is often less concern about being pleasing in person, manners, and appearance. The marital rights, the threat of in-law trouble, the prestige which comes from bearing sons, all give the woman a position of power. The man's power can be brutal, as the Turkish sultan's power to kill evidences in extreme form. The woman's power in polygamous countries comes from exploiting her strategic weapons. It is not surprising that in polygamous societies women are feared as the epitome of evil. Buddha said that, quote, "woman is the personification of evil," end quote. The modern Arab opinion is similar. We can thus conclude, fourth, that only in monogamy does the man have real rights, because only in the monogamous marriage is there a true union of man and wife. Instead of competition for a man's favor, the Christian monogamous marriage sees the woman united to her husband in godly faith and love. There is trust instead of rivalry. In such a marriage, the man commands a love, service, and loyalty which is not common to polygamous unions. He exercises rights unknown in other cultures. It is not an accident of history that in Christian countries, women are more responsible, more capable of productive work, and far more attractive than in other cultures. Christian monogamous marriage is marriage in its truest form, because it is faithful to the laws of creation. The social significance of the biblical standard is apparent in the research of J.D. Unwin. biblical law restricts sexual intercourse to marriage and holds the monogamous marriage to be the norm. Thus, premarital chastity is required, and marital fidelity also. Unwin began his research determined to dispel the idea that any necessary connection exists between the level of civilization and its sexual morality. He found instead that if we know the sexual regulations and conduct of a society, we can accurately quote-unquote prophesy, and the word is his, quote, the pattern of its cultural behavior, end quote. Mental development and cultural advance go hand in hand with the development of strict monogamy and premarital and postmarital chastity. A society with premarital and postmarital license is at a dead level culturally and mentally. It progresses to the degree that its sexual regulations move towards a strict monogamy. In 3 generations, the impact of a new morality is fully felt. As a result, Unwin felt the strict rules of chastity and continence cannot be unnatural, since they are productive of the best in nature. It is significant that Unwin's attempt to establish artificially or rationally a moral standard for a new society was an intellectual failure. Nothing can replace religious motivation for moral standards. It is significant also that those who idealize promiscuity and license as an ideal for man can only find their standards in very quote-unquote primitive or degraded cultures. 2 works which have greatly influenced the modern anti-Christian sexual license are Bronislaw Malinowski's The Sexual Life of Savages, 1929, and Boris de Rackevilc's Black Eros, The Sexual Customs of Africa from Prehistoric Times to the Present Day, 1956, in English, 1964. Malinowski's study of the Trobriand Islanders has been called, quote, virtually the Bible of all those supporting free love group living, end quote. Blake's comment on the supposedly ideal society of Malinowski's Trobriand is to the point. Quote, the noted anthropologist stated unequivocally that the, quote, Trobrianders know in their 3rd decade of our century, 1920 to 1930, no sexual perversions, no functional psychosis, no sex murder. They have no word for theft. Homosexuality and masturbation to them mean nothing but an unnatural and imperfect means of sexual gratification, a sign of disturbed capacity to reach normal satisfaction. The socially accepted form of sexual life is spontaneous monogamy without compulsion, a relationship which can be dissolved without difficulties. Thus, there is no promiscuity, end quote. Of course, there is no promiscuity, technically speaking, where there are no laws or social taboos. If there were no laws against murder, there would be no murder either. Where there is no obligation, no responsibility on anyone's part, it is simple enough to say that the problems of rape, adultery, child love, non-support, etc., do not exist, end quote. Similar justifications prevail today. We are assured that Denmark has seen a drop in sexual crimes with the abandonment of laws against pornography, but we are not told that most perversions are no longer regarded as criminal offenses, so that the decline in crime is in reality a decline in law enforcement. In such a context, statistics are more than worthless. They are dishonest.